the tech whistleblower who exposed social media's dark secrets. The story follows Jenny Bosch, a data scientist who discovers that her company, Nexus Social, is deliberately manipulating vulnerable users through sophisticated algorithms designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities for profit. Hey, this is Jay back on the Truth Tellers channel. Today's narrative explores Jenny's transformation from a believing tech insider to conflicted whistleblower. The corporate culture of Silicon World and the technical mechanics of algorithmic manipulation. The personal and professional costs of speaking truth to power. Legal battles, career destruction, and the slow process of social change. The emotional toll of maintaining a double life and challenging a powerful industry. As always, if you like this video, consider subscribing, liking, hit the notification bell for more. Remember, all our stories are taken from truth, brought to life by fiction.
The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, each droplet catching the neon glow of San Francisco's financial district below. Jenny Bosch sat hunched over her laptop in the dimly lit office, the blue light from her screen casting sharp shadows across her angular face. At 34, she had the kind of intense focus that had made her one of Nexus Corporation's most valuable data scientists. But tonight, that same intensity was eating her alive from the inside. The email thread on her screen contained attachments that would change everything: internal documents, algorithm specifications, and data analyses that painted a horrifying picture of how Nexus Social, the world's largest social media platform with over 3 billion users, actually operated behind its glossy, user-friendly interface. Jenny's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she stared at the draft email addressed to investigative journalist Sarah Ming at the San Francisco Chronicle. One click would transform her from a highly compensated tech executive into a pariah, a traitor to the industry that had made her wealthy beyond her childhood dreams growing up in a cramped apartment in Oakland's Chinatown. The cursor blinked mockingly in the subject line, Platform manipulation and user harm, confidential documents attached. 6 months earlier, Jenny had been living a different life entirely. She owned a sleek Mission District loft, drove a Tesla Model S, and commanded a salary that put her in the top 1% of earners. More importantly, she genuinely believed she was making the world a better place. Nexus Social's mission statement, connecting humanity through authentic relationships, wasn't just corporate speak to her, it was a calling. Her role as Senior Director of Algorithmic Ethics sounded noble, even necessary. Jenny's team was responsible for ensuring that Nexus's recommendation algorithms promoted healthy user behavior and prevented the spread of harmful content. She spent her days analyzing user engagement patterns, tweaking content promotion algorithms, and writing reports about platform safety that were distributed to senior leadership. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She had been the ethical window dressing on a fundamentally corrupt system. The revelation began with a routine data analysis request from CEO Marcus Holloway's office. Nexus was facing increasing pressure from Congress about teen mental health and platform addiction. Jenny's team was asked to prepare a comprehensive report on how the platform's algorithms affected vulnerable user populations, particularly adolescents. What she found in the data made her physically ill. The algorithms weren't just failing to protect vulnerable users, they were actively targeting them. The system had identified that content promoting eating disorders, self-harm, and suicidal ideation generated significantly higher engagement rates among users aged 13 to 17. Instead of suppressing this content, the algorithms were designed to promote it, creating what the internal documentation cynically referred to as engagement optimization through emotional volatility. Jenny remembered the exact moment her worldview shattered. She was sitting in Conference Room C on the 38th floor, presenting her preliminary findings to the Algorithmic Ethics Review Board. The room was filled with some of the smartest people she had ever worked with: PhD data scientists from Stanford and MIT, former Google and Facebook executives, brilliant minds who had built the digital infrastructure of modern communication. The correlation between harmful content exposure and increased platform usage is statistically significant across all demographic segments, Jenny had explained, clicking through slides filled with charts and graphs. However, the effect is most pronounced in adolescent users, where exposure to self-harm content increases daily active usage by an average of 23%. She expected concern, maybe even alarm. Instead, she was met with nods of recognition and requests for more granular analysis. "This is incredibly valuable data, Jenny," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Nexus's Chief Technology Officer. "Can you break this down by content category? We need to understand which types of emotional triggers are most effective for different user segments." The room fell silent as Jenny realized what she was hearing. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The algorithms weren't accidentally promoting harmful content to vulnerable users. They were designed to do exactly that. Jenny's investigation deepened over the following weeks. Working late into the night and on weekends, she used her administrative access to dig deeper into Nexus's internal systems. What she discovered was a comprehensive architecture of manipulation that would have impressed George Orwell. The Emotional Influence Engine, as it was known internally, tracked users' emotional states through their behavior patterns, how long they lingered on certain posts, their scrolling speed, the time they spent crafting comments they ultimately didn't send. The system could predict with 94% accuracy when a user was experiencing depression, anxiety, loneliness, or other vulnerable emotional states. Rather than providing support or healthier content during these periods, the algorithm deliberately amplified content designed to deepen negative emotional states. Depressed users received more content about failures and disappointments. Anxious users saw more posts about threats and dangers. Lonely users were shown content about successful relationships and social gatherings they couldn't access, designed to increase their sense of isolation and dependence on the platform for social connection. The internal research was chilling in its clinical detachment. One study, conducted over 6 months with a control group of 100,000 teenage users, found that those exposed to the enhanced emotional targeting showed a 47% increase in self-reported symptoms of depression and a 31% increase in self-harm behaviors. The study's conclusion wasn't to modify the system to protect these users. It was to refine the targeting to be even more effective. Subject emotional dependency on platform validation appears to be a reliable predictor of long-term user retention and advertising revenue generation, read one particularly damning report. Recommendation: expand emotional volatility protocols to additional user segments, with particular focus on users aged 13 to 19 during identified vulnerable periods. Jenny printed out hundreds of pages of internal documents, each one more disturbing than the last. The company had identified that users experiencing major life transitions, starting college, relationship breakups, job loss, death of family members, were most susceptible to algorithmic manipulation. Instead of providing support, the system was designed to exploit these moments of vulnerability for maximum engagement and profit. The personal cost of her investigation began to manifest in ways Jenny hadn't anticipated. She found herself unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of the teenagers whose data she analyzed daily. These weren't just statistics. They were real people, kids who were being systematically manipulated by software she had helped design. Her relationship with David, her partner of 3 years, began to deteriorate as she became increasingly consumed by her research. A fellow tech worker at a startup, David initially supported her concerns, but grew frustrated with her obsessive behavior and refusal to discuss the details of what she was discovering. "You're becoming paranoid, Jenny," he said during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "These companies aren't evil. They're just trying to build products people want to use." "You don't understand," Jenny replied, her voice strained with exhaustion. "They're not building products people want. They're engineering addiction. They're literally rewiring teenage brains for profit." David's response reflected the cognitive dissonance Jenny was encountering everywhere in Silicon Valley. The tech industry had convinced itself that any innovation that increased user engagement was inherently positive, a form of progress that benefited everyone. The possibility that this engagement might come at the cost of user well-being was either ignored or rationalized away as an unfortunate but necessary side effect of connecting the world. Ginny began to feel isolated within her own workplace. Colleagues who had previously sought her input on ethical considerations started avoiding her in the hallways. Her invitations to important meetings were rescinded. Her access to certain databases was quietly revoked without explanation. The breaking point came during a presentation to Nexus's board of directors. Jenny had been asked to present her findings on youth mental health and platform usage, ostensibly as part of the company's commitment to user safety. She prepared a carefully documented presentation outlining the correlation between algorithmic content promotion and increased rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm among teenage users. Marcus Holloway, Nexus's charismatic CEO, listened to her presentation with the same intense attention he brought to quarterly earnings reports. At 46, Holloway had the lean build and intense gaze of someone who viewed every interaction as a competition to be won. His response to Jenny's findings revealed the true nature of Nexus's corporate culture. "This is fascinating research, Jenny," he said, his voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for discussions of revenue growth. "The correlation between emotional engagement and platform loyalty is stronger than we suspected. Jennifer, I want your team to explore how we can leverage these insights to improve user retention across all demographics." Jenny felt the room spinning as she realized the full implications of what she was hearing. "Mr. Holloway, I think there may be some misunderstanding. These findings suggest that our algorithms are actively harming vulnerable users, particularly teenagers. The recommendation would be to modify the system to prioritize user well-being over engagement metrics." The silence that followed was deafening. Holloway's expression shifted from enthusiasm to something colder, more calculating. "Jenny, I appreciate your concern for our users, but we need to remember that Nexus is a business. Our shareholders expect us to maximize platform engagement and advertising revenue. User well-being is important, of course, but it can't come at the expense of our core business objectives." Dr. Walsh nodded in agreement. "We should also consider that users are choosing to engage with this content. We're simply providing them with more of what they demonstrate they want to see." "Jenny," as hands trembled as she tried to formulate a response, "but the users don't understand how the algorithm works. They don't know that their emotional vulnerabilities are being systematically exploited. They think they're just scrolling through posts from friends, but every piece of content they see has been carefully selected to maximize their psychological dependence on the platform." Board member Robert Chen, no relation to Jenny despite sharing her surname, leaned forward in his chair. "That's precisely what makes this so valuable. Conscious manipulation would be obvious and therefore ineffective. The beauty of algorithmic influence is that it operates below the threshold of user awareness." Jenny left that meeting knowing she could no longer remain complicit in what she now understood to be a massive psychological manipulation operation, disguised as a social networking platform. But the decision to become a whistleblower wasn't made in a moment of righteous anger. It was a gradual process that played out over weeks of sleepless nights and moral anguish. The legal and personal risks of going public were enormous. Jenny's employment contract included comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that would expose her to millions of dollars in damages for revealing proprietary information. Nexus's legal team was known for its aggressive tactics against former employees who violated their NDAs, including private investigators, employment blacklisting, and protracted legal battles designed to financially destroy whistleblowers. Jenny consulted with 3 different attorneys, each of whom painted an increasingly grim picture of what she could expect if she chose to reveal Nexus's internal practices. The most optimistic assessment suggested she would face at least 2 years of legal proceedings, complete professional ostracism from the tech industry, and legal fees that would consume her savings. "You need to understand that this isn't just about your career," warned attorney Rachel Foster, who specialized in whistleblower protection cases. "Nexus has resources that most individuals simply can't compete with. They can make your life very difficult for a very long time." Jenny also struggled with more philosophical questions about the nature of her revelations. Was she betraying the trust of colleagues who had shared confidential information with her? Were the manipulative practices she had discovered fundamentally different from traditional advertising and marketing techniques? Did users bear some responsibility for their own choices to engage with content that made them feel worse? These questions kept her awake at night as she wrestled with the decision. The tech industry's culture of disruption and innovation had always appealed to Jenny because it seemed to prioritize solving problems over maintaining traditional power structures. But she was beginning to understand that the same disruptive mindset that could revolutionize communication and commerce could also be used to exploit human psychology on an unprecedented scale. The moment that finally convinced her to act came from an unexpected source. Jenny was grabbing coffee at a shop near Nexus's headquarters when she overheard a conversation between two teenagers at a nearby table. The younger girl, who couldn't have been more than 15, was describing her struggles with an eating disorder to her friend. "I know I should get off social media, but I can't," she said, her voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. "Every time I try to delete the app, I just reinstall it a few hours later. It's like I'm addicted to feeling bad about myself." Jenny recognized the pattern immediately. This girl was almost certainly caught in one of Nexus's emotional manipulation loops, receiving a carefully curated stream of content designed to reinforce her insecurities and keep her scrolling. The algorithm had identified her vulnerabilities and was exploiting them for profit. That night, Jenny began copying files. The process of gathering evidence was more complex and dangerous than Jenny had anticipated. Nexus's internal systems logged all user access, making it risky to download large numbers of sensitive documents without triggering security protocols. Jenny had to be strategic, accessing files gradually over several weeks and using her legitimate research activities as cover for her broader investigation. She focused on 3 categories of evidence: technical documentation of the algorithmic systems, internal research on user psychological manipulation, and communications between executives that demonstrated their awareness of the harmful effects of these practices. The technical documentation was the most difficult to obtain and understand. The emotional influence engine was incredibly sophisticated, incorporating machine learning models that could process thousands of variables to predict and influence user behavior. The system didn't just react to user actions. It proactively shaped user experiences to produce desired emotional and behavioral outcomes. One particularly damning document outlined what engineers called vulnerability windows, periods when users were most susceptible to manipulation. The system had identified that users were most vulnerable to emotional manipulation within the first 15 minutes of waking up, during lunch breaks at work, and in the hour before bedtime. Content delivery was specifically optimized for these periods to maximize psychological impact. The internal research documentation was even more disturbing. Nexus had conducted extensive studies on the psychological effects of different types of content on various user demographics. The research was methodologically rigorous and would have been impressive if it weren't being used to systematically harm people. One study had tracked the mental health outcomes of 50,000 teenage users over 18 months, comparing those exposed to different algorithmic content strategies. The results showed that users exposed to the, quote, enhanced emotional engagement protocol showed significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm, but also spent 67% more time on the platform and generated 134% more advertising revenue. The study's recommendations were chilling. Results suggest that moderate increases in user psychological distress are an acceptable trade-off for significant improvements in engagement and revenue metrics. Recommend expanding enhanced engagement protocols to additional user segments, with careful monitoring to ensure distress levels remain below thresholds that might prompt users to seek offline mental health intervention or platform abandonment. Jenny also discovered evidence of Nexus's efforts to suppress external research on the psychological effects of social media usage. The company had funded academic studies designed to produce favorable results, pressured researchers to modify conclusions that were critical of social media's mental health impacts, and used legal threats to prevent the publication of unfavorable research. The executive communications Ginny uncovered revealed a corporate culture that was fully aware of the harmful effects of their practices, but viewed them as acceptable costs of doing business. Email threads between senior leaders discussed user mental health impacts with the same casual detachment they might use to analyze server costs or office supply expenses. In one particularly damning exchange, CEO Marcus Holloway responded to a report about increased suicide rates among teenage users in markets where Nexus had recently introduced enhanced algorithmic targeting, obviously concerning from a PR perspective, but the engagement numbers are incredible. Let's see if we can refine the targeting to maintain the engagement lift while reducing the most extreme negative outcomes. We need plausible deniability if this becomes a public issue. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's response was equally callous. The correlation between our algorithm changes and these outcomes isn't definitive enough to establish causation in any legal sense. We should be fine as long as we avoid any internal communications that acknowledge direct causal relationships. I'll brief the team on appropriate language for discussing these issues. Jenny also found evidence that Nexus was actively lobbying against legislative efforts to regulate social media platforms and protect vulnerable users. The company had spent millions of dollars on lobbying firms and political contributions designed to prevent oversight of their algorithmic practices. Internal communications revealed that Nexus executives viewed regulation as an existential threat to their business model. Our entire competitive advantage is based on our ability to influence user behavior more effectively than our competitors. Read one internal strategy document. Any regulation that limits our algorithmic capabilities or requires transparency in our recommendation systems would essentially destroy our profit margins and market position. The company had also developed sophisticated public relations strategies to discredit critics and deflect attention from harmful practices. Nexus maintained relationships with dozens of academic researchers, think tanks, and advocacy organizations that could be deployed to provide favorable commentary whenever the company faced criticism. Jenny discovered that her own role as Director of Algorithmic Ethics was part of this PR strategy. Her team's reports and recommendations were never intended to change company practices. They were designed to create the appearance of ethical oversight for external audiences, while having no actual impact on how the platform operated. As Ginny compiled her evidence, she began reaching out to potential allies who might help her expose Nexus's practices. Her first contact was with Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a former colleague who had left Nexus 2 years earlier after becoming uncomfortable with the company's direction. Rodriguez had taken a position as a professor of computer ethics at UC Berkeley and had been privately critical of social media manipulation practices. Their meeting at a small restaurant in Berkeley felt like a spy novel. Rodriguez listened intently as Ginny outlined what she had discovered, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the implications of what she was telling him. I suspected something like this was happening, but the scale and sophistication you're describing is beyond what I imagined, Rodriguez said, shaking his head in disbelief. The fact that they're specifically targeting vulnerable populations makes this unconscionable. Rodriguez agreed to help Jenny understand the broader implications of her findings and connect her with other researchers and advocates who were working on similar issues. He also provided Jenny with crucial advice about protecting herself legally and professionally. You need to understand that going public with this information will likely end your career in tech, he warned. These companies have long memories and extensive networks. Even if you're legally protected as a whistleblower, you'll probably never work in Silicon Valley again. Jenny's second key contact was investigative journalist Sarah Ming at the San Francisco Chronicle. Ming had been covering the tech industry for over a decade and had written several high-profile exposés of corporate misconduct at major technology companies. She was known for her rigorous fact-checking and her ability to protect confidential sources. Their initial meeting was cautious on both sides. Ming was skeptical of Jenny's claims, having heard similar allegations from disgruntled employees that had failed to hold up under scrutiny. Jenny was nervous about trusting her career and potentially her freedom to a journalist she had never met. These are serious allegations, And if they're true, they represent one of the biggest corporate scandals in tech history, Ming said after reviewing a sample of Jenny's documentation. But I need to be absolutely certain of the authenticity and accuracy of this material before I can move forward with publication. Ming's verification process was exhaustive. She brought in independent technical experts to review the algorithmic documentation, cross-referenced Jenny's internal communications with publicly available information, and interviewed former Nexus employees to corroborate Jenny's claims about company culture and practices. The process took months and required Jenny to take increasingly dangerous risks to provide additional documentation and clarification. Each new request for information meant another opportunity for Nexus's security systems to detect her activities and expose her as the source of the leak. The strain of maintaining her double life began to take a severe toll on Jen's mental and physical health. She lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder for signs that she had been discovered. Her relationship with David finally ended when she was unable to explain her increasingly erratic behavior without revealing her whistleblowing activities. "I don't know who you are anymore, Jenny," David said during their final conversation. "You've become paranoid and secretive. You won't talk to me about what's bothering you, but you clearly don't trust me with whatever's going on in your life." Jenny wanted desperately to explain the situation to David, but she knew that involving him would put both of them at risk. Nexus's legal agreements included provisions that could hold third parties liable for receiving confidential information, even if they weren't the original source of the leak. The isolation was crushing. Jenny had always been someone who processed stress by talking through problems with friends and colleagues, but her whistleblowing activities had effectively cut her off from her entire social and professional network. She couldn't discuss her work with anyone at Nexus, couldn't explain her behavior to friends outside the company, and couldn't seek support from family members who wouldn't understand the technical and ethical complexities of her situation. Jenny found herself spending entire weekends alone in her apartment, obsessively reviewing documents and wondering whether she was making the right decision. The evidence of Nexus's harmful practices was overwhelming, but the personal cost of exposing them seemed to grow larger each day. She also began to question whether her revelations would actually change anything. Nexus was a massive corporation with enormous political influence and virtually unlimited legal resources. Even if her whistleblowing led to negative publicity, regulatory investigation, or legal action, the company might simply modify its practices slightly while continuing to profit from psychological manipulation. The tech industry's track record on ethical scandals wasn't encouraging. Previous revelations about data privacy violations, election interference, and mental health impacts had generated headlines and congressional hearings, but had failed to produce meaningful changes in how these platforms operated. The investigation by Sarah Ming and her team at the Chronicle was nearing completion when Jenny's activities were finally discovered by Nexus's security systems. An automated alert flagged unusual patterns in her document access activities, triggering a security review that quickly identified her as the source of the leaked information. Jenny was called into a meeting with Human Resources and Legal on a Friday afternoon in late November. She knew immediately that her secret was out when she saw the grim expressions of the people waiting for her in the conference room. "Jenny, we've become aware that you may have accessed and copied confidential company information without authorization," said Janet Morrison, Nexus's Director of Legal Affairs. "This is an extremely serious matter that could constitute theft of trade secrets and violation of your employment agreements." Jenny had prepared for this moment, but the reality was still terrifying. She was facing some of the most powerful lawyers in Silicon Valley, people who had successfully destroyed other whistleblowers who had tried to expose corporate wrongdoing. "I'm aware of the allegations," Jenny replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd like to consult with my attorney before discussing this matter further." Morrison's response was swift and harsh. "You're terminated effective immediately. Your access to all company systems has been revoked, and security will escort you from the building. We'll be conducting a full investigation of your activities, and if we find evidence of theft or misappropriation of confidential information, we will pursue all available legal remedies." The walk to her office to collect her personal belongings was humiliating. Security guards flanked her as colleagues watched with mixtures of curiosity and pity. Jenny realized that most of them probably assumed she had been caught in some form of personal misconduct rather than corporate whistleblowing. As she packed her belongings, Jenny felt a strange sense of relief mixed with terror. The secret that had consumed her life for months was finally out, at least within Nexus. There would be no more sleepless nights wondering when she would be discovered, no more careful planning to avoid security detection, no more lies to colleagues and friends. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Nexus would use every resource at their disposal to discredit her, destroy her financially, and prevent her revelations from gaining public attention. The next phase would be far more dangerous than anything she had experienced so far. The San Francisco Chronicle published Jenny's story 3 weeks later, after extensive legal review and additional verification of her claims. The headline read, "Internal documents reveal social media giants' deliberate manipulation of vulnerable users." The article was accompanied by an interactive website that allowed readers to examine key pieces of evidence and understand how Nexus's algorithms worked to exploit human psychology. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours of publication, the story was trending on social media platforms around the world, creating the ironic situation where Nexus's own competitors were amplifying criticism of Nexus's practices. Congressional leaders called for immediate hearings. Mental health advocates organized protests outside Nexus's headquarters, and the company's stock price dropped by 15% in after-hours trading. Jenny watched the media coverage from her lawyer's office, where she was preparing for the legal and public relations onslaught that would inevitably follow. Nexus had already filed preliminary injunctions seeking to prevent further publication of their internal documents and had issued a statement characterizing Jenny as a, quote, disgruntled employee who had illegally stolen proprietary information. The company's public response was a masterclass in corporate crisis management. CEO Marcus Holloway appeared on multiple news programs, expressing concern for user well-being while denying that Nexus had ever deliberately manipulated users for profit. The company announced the formation of an independent ethics review board and promised to implement new safeguards to protect vulnerable users. Jenny watched these performances with a mixture of anger and admiration. Holloway was genuinely charismatic and persuasive, and his responses were carefully crafted to acknowledge problems while avoiding any admission of intentional wrongdoing. To viewers who weren't familiar with the internal documents Jenny had leaked, his explanations might seem reasonable and responsible. The legal battle began almost immediately. Nexus's attorneys filed a comprehensive lawsuit alleging theft of trade secrets, breach of contract, and violation of computer fraud statutes. They sought damages in the tens of millions of dollars and requested court orders that would effectively prevent Jenny from discussing her revelations publicly. Jenny's legal team, led by whistleblower attorney Rachel Foster, filed counterclaims under federal and state whistleblower protection statutes. They argued that Jenny's disclosures were protected because they revealed illegal practices that posed significant threats to public health and safety. The case would likely take years to resolve, during which Jenny would be unable to work in her chosen field and would face enormous legal expenses. But she had crossed a line from which there was no return, and she was committed to seeing the process through to its conclusion. 6 months after the initial publication, the impact of Jenny's revelations continued to reverberate through the tech industry and beyond. Congressional hearings had led to proposed legislation requiring transparency in social media algorithms and establishing penalties for platforms that deliberately manipulated vulnerable users. Several state attorneys general had launched investigations into Nexus's practices, and international regulators were considering similar actions. The personal cost to Jenny had been severe but not as devastating as she had feared. While she was effectively blacklisted from major tech companies, she had received job offers from academic institutions, advocacy organizations, and smaller tech companies that were committed to ethical practices. The legal battles continued, but crowdfunding campaigns and support from advocacy groups had helped cover her expenses. More importantly, Jenny began to see evidence that her revelations were actually changing how people thought about social media and its impact on mental health. Schools were implementing digital literacy programs that taught students about algorithmic manipulation. Mental health professionals were developing new treatment approaches for social media addiction. Parents were having more informed conversations with their children about online platform usage. The changes weren't revolutionary, and Nexus remained a profitable and powerful company. But Jenny's disclosures had created space for public discussion about the ethics of algorithmic manipulation and the responsibility of technology companies to prioritize user well-being over profit maximization. Jenny reflected on her decision as she sat in the same coffee shop where she had overheard the conversation that convinced her to become a whistleblower. The teenage girl who had talked about her social media addiction wasn't there, but Jenny wondered whether her story might have reached someone like her, someone who could now understand that their struggles with social media weren't personal failings, but the result of sophisticated manipulation designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. The tech industry's culture of move fast and break things had always celebrated disruption as an inherently positive force. Jenny's story suggested a different possibility, that the most important disruption might come from people willing to expose the human cost of technological progress and demand that innovation serve human flourishing, rather than simply maximizing engagement and profit. As she typed her final email to Sarah Ming, Jenny realized that her role as a whistleblower was just beginning. The documents she had revealed were only the tip of the iceberg, and the broader questions about technology, psychology, and corporate responsibility that her story had raised would require ongoing attention from journalists, regulators, researchers, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept that psychological manipulation was an acceptable price for digital connectivity. The rain had stopped, and weak afternoon sunlight filtered through the coffee shop windows. Jenny closed her laptop and walked out onto the street, ready to face whatever came next in her transformation from tech insider to advocate for the people caught in the algorithms she had once helped design. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for speaking up. Your story helped me understand why I felt so bad every time I used social media. I deleted the app last week, and I already feel better. A grateful stranger." Jenny smiled for the first time in months. The personal cost of her decision had been enormous, but messages like this reminded her why she had been willing to sacrifice her career and financial security to expose the truth about social media manipulation. The tech industry would eventually adapt to increased scrutiny and regulation, just as it had adapted to previous challenges. New forms of manipulation would emerge, requiring new whistleblowers to step forward and expose them. But Jenny's story had established an important precedent, that people working inside these companies had both the power and the responsibility to speak up when technology was being used to harm, rather than help the people it was supposed to serve. As she walked through the Mission District toward her apartment, Jenny thought about the thousands of engineers, data scientists, and product managers who were currently working on systems designed to manipulate human behavior for corporate profit. Some of them were probably experiencing the same moral conflicts she had felt, wondering whether their technical skills were being used in ways that violated their values and harmed vulnerable people. Her story was an invitation to those individuals, a demonstration that it was possible to speak truth to power, even when the cost was significant, and that their specialized knowledge gave them unique responsibilities to protect the people affected by their work. Jenny Bosch, the tech whistleblower who exposed social media's dark secrets, had started a conversation that would outlast her individual story and continue as long as technology remained a central force in human life. The question wasn't whether other insiders would follow her example, but when they would find the courage to put human well-being ahead of corporate loyalty and add their voices to the growing chorus of those demanding that technology serve humanity rather than exploit it.